Thank you. That set up expectations which I have to work hard even to half fulfill. Anyway, thank you for coming. It's a delight to see you here. This is the title of the book. Yeah, and do we need another book on Mona Lisa? This is the obvious question. Mona Lisa is everywhere. I've got my Mona Lisa socks on. Judd my PA has her Mona Lisa socks on, but disappointingly she's not wearing her Mona Lisa t-shirt. But it is astonishing. It's an amazing, amazing phenomenon. And for a long time I thought I don't want to write a book on Mona Lisa. But it gets everywhere. This is after the Labour Party conference in Brighton. This is the Corby Lisa. And it's no relevance, is it, really? Why choose Mona Lisa? It's just astonishing, the kind of reach and that it gets. And as it must be the world's most famous painting, probably the world's most famous image. I mean, I've done interviews in Africa and all over, not travelling, I have to say. So it is extraordinary. You think everything would have been said about it by this time. This is my co-author, Giuseppe Palanti, who is an economics teacher. He teaches economics in a school for tourism in Florence. And he spends his spare time doing archival work. Amazing fluency and incredibly difficult documents, which I would choose not to read if I had a choice. And he goes, say, into the archive of Leonardo's father, Sir Piero da Vinci. He just goes through all the notarial acts. An academic probably wouldn't do that these days because it's too slow. You can't guarantee results. So in this age of instant publication and research reviews, for an academic to do this very slow-burning work is not an attractive thing. Anyway, he'd published 2 little books with some of the documents he'd got, but without any art historical context for it. So I met him in Florence and I said, why don't we collaborate? And he said, I hoped you'd say that. And so the collaboration came about. And it's he who has produced, with my pointing and my assistance, obviously, the major documents. The book falls into 3 parts. There is the part of the new documentation. I'm not primarily going to be dealing with that here. Obviously, you can't do the whole book, but I will give you one glimpse of that. The second part is the history of the painting. And we will see the beginning of it. We really do know who the sitter is. People still want it to be somebody other than Lisa Gherardini or Lisa del Giocondo as she was married, because she's not exceptional enough in terms of the historical record, at least. So people want some mystery or some magic or some big figure or some scandal. But as we will see, it's perfectly orthodox. And the third part is how the painting developed, how its content developed from a commissioned portrait, a perfectly orthodox starting point, and developed into something very remarkable, which I have called a universal picture. And I'm going to be doing part of that, looking at how it developed from basically a Renaissance mugshot into something which has the current grip it has upon our imaginations. That's just an indication of the contents, but you needn't pay attention to that. Looking at the documentation, probably the thing that got most news is that we've identified Leonardo's mother, and I'm just giving this as a sample as to what we've done. I said to Giuseppe, Vinci is a small town, it's 100 houses at that time, and I said Caterina, and we know his mother's name was Caterina, must be traceable. And the Florentines who ruled Florence invented the property tax, which we may not be perpetually grateful to them for, but for the historian it's just wonderful, because it lists all the households. They all lie about the property they have, as people do with their tax returns, but they're very good at listing what they call the bocche, that's to say the mouths that they're anybody who's had children will know listing children as mouths is rather a good idea. But in any event, this is the key document which Giuseppe found. It's the catasto, the tax return of somebody called Giovanna Lippi. Lippi is a very common name in Vinci, and the electrician shop is still run by a branch of the family. This is 1451, a year before Leonardo was born, and this is the widow's posthumous tax declaration rounding up her affairs, as it were. And at the bottom two lines, you've got Caterina, her granddaughter, aged 15, and you've got Papo, her grandson, aged 2. The father, who is a man called Bartolomeo, disappeared. We don't know who the mother's was. So you've got this vulnerable 15-year-old girl with an infant brother, and clearly open to flattery and seduction by a rising young lawyer. Sir Piero da Vinci was making his trade in Florence. It was a family of lawyers and landowners. Not rich, but certainly well off. He's very successful. And this is before he was married. Sir Piero was married the next year. So Caterina di Meo Lippi is there. She's absolutely the right candidate for this. She was married off pretty quickly to a local man called Antonio Buti, and they must have provided a dowry, the family, because no man, whatever his status, is going to take on a young woman who's just had a child with an infant grandchild. So it's what the Times called Ma Vinci, which I thought was rather nice. Headline writers often don't come up with something as good as that. But what we do in the first part of the book is to say these are ordinary people, and you can trace their careers. They're not legends. They're just ordinary people. Leonardo, in a sense, is an ordinary person. He has to live. He has to pay money. He has to eat food, and he lives a normal life. The trouble is with Mona Lisa and Leonardo, you can't really think of them as normal people. The second part of the book, I look at the evidence about the picture, who it is, and what we know about it. And this is a 15th century printed book, I think 1488, and it's an edition of Cicero's letters to his friends. Cicero, a great hero of the humanists, and it was owned by a man called Agostino Vespucci. From the famous family, but not the main branch of the family. His branch came from Pisa. But he was a clerk, a humanist clerk, i.e. expert in Latin, who served the Florentine Republic and did various things for them. And he incidentally wrote out the account in Italian of the Battle of Anghiari, which Leonardo was supposed to be painting on the wall of the council hall in Florence. And he did other things for Leonardo. So Agostino Vespucci is well informed. And here he's coming across a passage about Apelles, the great Greek painter, and scores out one of the P's because it's spelt wrongly. And he latches onto a passage where it says that when Apelles painted Venus, he painted the head and bust in a very fully finished way, but left the rest of the body inchoate. This may be sketchy or unfinished. He says this is what Leonardo does. Apelles the painter, this is this inscription here. This is what Leonardo da Vinci does in all his pictures, as in the head of Lisa del Giocondo and Anne, the mother of Mary. We know he was working on a composition of the Virgin Child and St. Anne at this time. And we will see what he will do in the Hall of the Great Council, about which he's made agreement with the standard bearer. This was the Great Commission for the Battle of Anghiari, alongside Michelangelo, who was painting the Battle of Cascina. And you may have read in the press the continual stories about the search underneath the existing frescoes for the painting. I think it's not there, and if it was, it would be a wreck. It would be completely illegible. Anyway, that goes on, but he's well informed. And as we see, Da Vinci does this as in the head of Lisa del Giocondo. This is Lisa Gherardini, who married Francesco del Giocondo. Francesco is called a silk merchant, which he indeed was, but he would trade in anything. He traded in leather from Ireland, sugar from Madeira, and was involved certainly in the slave trade to some extent. More slaves went through his hands than he had need for. He was a sharp operator. He put backs up and wasn't universally popular. He came from not distinguished stock. His grandfather was a barrel maker. Lisa Gherardini came from the Gherardini, who were landed gentry and had a good name and not much money. So this is a very familiar story of new money attracting in landed gentry, attracting in a good name. And we've got lots of documents in the first half of the book showing how they lived, how Lisa lived, and et cetera, et cetera. But I'm not going to cover that in detail here. What I'm going to be looking at is a particular theme from the book, which I hope will be of interest to you, and it's central to understanding how Mona Lisa developed into a kind of philosophical picture, developed from a portrait into something of a quite different kind. Mona Lisa and the Body of the Earth. And first of all, what are we looking at with Mona Lisa? We're looking at a painting in the Louvre. How many people have seen it in the Louvre? Well, I should perhaps ask how many people have not seen it in the Louvre in a way, because that's the experience. It is the real thing. I've twice seen her or it come out of its frame, and I can tell you it is the real thing there, but the experience is so difficult, isn't it? You can't really see it properly. You're crowded with people, and it's in a glazed frame and then in this fortified chamber. So, and it's not, for the most part, a great experience. People first of all say, well, it's rather small and I couldn't really see it. And when it comes out of its frame, you think, this could be a disaster. If it doesn't do anything, then, but when it comes out, the presence of Mona Lisa is just extraordinary. The one on the left is a digital restoration by Pascal Cotte, who I've collaborated with, who runs Lumiere Technology in Paris. And this is not photoshopped. It's not just messing around with the colors like I might do. He's got algorithms for taking off dirty varnish, for taking away the cracks, and also for making the pigments correspond to the pigment analysis, which you can do with optical scanning from the spectrum the pigments get off. So this is not exactly what Mona Lisa looked like originally, but it's a lot closer. There's a lot more space, isn't there? There's a kind of a lightness and an openness to the whole composition, which is very telling. And I'll be using Pascal's images, not because I say it's I'm necessarily saying it looked exactly like that, but it works better to give a sense of how vivid and communicative the painting is. It has enormous presence. Some artists can give their works presence. It's a kind of twitchy thing, and Leonardo can certainly do that. I'm going to do the Body of the Earth in three ways. First of all, a little beginning bit about how did Leonardo think the eye worked, which may seem to be irrelevant, but for Leonardo, you can't understand anything without understanding optics. Unless you understand the process out there of the optics and what they do inside here and what they do inside here, you don't really understand what you're looking at. You can't just look at things and take it for granted. Then water and the body of the earth, the ancient history of the body of the earth and the microcosm, and all that I hope will become clear in due course. First of all, the optics out there. All artists have known, anybody who painted a portrait in light and shade or a figure in light and shade knew you needed to model a figure in a particular kind of way. For Leonardo, that's not good enough. He has to say, how does light behave on forms? How can we understand different intensities of light on a body? On the left here, oops, sorry. On the left here, we've got, that's a window with a ball or a sphere. And obviously it's not illuminated in bands like that, but he's doing it for the purpose of analysis. And he's showing the grading of light and shade on a regular body. Over on the other side here, he's showing a human head with this light impinging on it. And he explains that the intensity of light is proportional to the angle of impact. That's to say, if we have something comes down and hits vertically, he calls it percussione in Italian, which is nice. It's a physical thing. If you have percussione at right angles, it's terrifically strong and will give a very bright light. A 45-degree one will give half the light, 33.5 degrees a third, and so on. So it's a precisely graded system of light and shade. It's related, though different geometry, to what computers do with ray tracing. But he has to understand that. For Leonardo, he can't just do it empirically and say, I'm looking at the head and that's how it works. He needs to know the law that underlines the action. And he also is interested in rebound. Florentine artists, on the whole, didn't do reflected light. It destroyed the kind of plastic sense that they went for. But Leonardo is immensely interested here. you've got these spheres. This is a thought experiment. It's not an observation. You've got the sun, the light up there. You've got a box or a room, and you get this glimmer of light on the underside here. This is the Virgin of the Rocks in the National Gallery, London. You can see the angel has got exactly that. The Virgin's hand has a Mona Lisa. You can more or less see that. It's got lots of back reflections, light surfaces going back into the shadow. We may take that as obvious, but it absolutely wasn't obvious. And for Leonardo, it reflects his theoretical interests and understanding. And he takes it into his science. The Codex Leicester, from relatively late in Leonardo's life, now owned by Bill Gates. I'm working with an Italian colleague on a new edition of it. He looks at the issue of the light on the moon in relation to the sun and the earth. So I keep pressing the wrong button here. I thought I'd probably do that. Here is the Corpus Solare, the sun. Here is the moon, obviously not done to scale, but just a demonstration. And here is the earth. And he looks at this phenomenon of the ashen light, as it's called, in the new moon. That the new moon, if you look at it, if you can see it at all through all the sort of light pollution we have, the shaded part of the moon is not uniformly dark. It's glimmers. It's got an ashen light. In Latin, it's called lumen cinereum. And Leonardo is interested in it and how you can explain it. And he's looking at here, and he says what's happening is that when the new moon is there, that the light from the sun is hitting the earth and reflected back into the moon. So this is earth light on the moon, which is exactly right, and Galileo came up with that about a century later. And here in this little diagram, the miraculous shading, you've got this attempt to evoke the light, the ashen light of the moon. He's an amazingly delicate draftsman, Leonardo, who can work on tiny, tiny scales. And he also notices something which is a feature of the eye and is not just what happens out there. And he explains that where that ashen light abuts the very brilliant crescent of the moon, it looks darker. And where it's against the blackness of the void at the top, it looks lighter. And this is not just optics, this is how the eye works. It's an edge contrast. Which artists probably knew about, but Leonardo here is taking it into the science. The varying field is generated. This is, give you an idea, Leonardo's prose is quite heavy going in many ways. The varying field is generated because that part of the field which borders on the luminous part of the moon, in comparison with such brightness, shows itself darker than it is, and so on. So he's looking at this subjective contrast where dark and light things beside each other push each other in opposite directions. The dark makes the light look lighter and vice versa. This is the first time I know of any explanation of any scientist saying, I'm not just telling you what we're looking at out there, but I'm telling you how you see it. And it means that understanding how we see something is absolutely vital if we're to make sense of what we're looking at as a scientist in this case. And he takes it into his paintings. This is the backs, the shoulders of St. Anne and the Virgin in the Louvre picture. And you can see here he sets off light against dark consistently and even runs additional white light pigment down to make that really jump out at you. So it's in painting and it's in science, and it's about the act of seeing. He also is aware, by the time he's painting Mona Lisa from 1503 onwards, that the eye is a complicated structure. As a young man, he assumes that what you see is what you see, and it's straightforward. You just look hard enough and you know how something works. Having got access, probably via Latin or even via translation, to the writings of an Islamic scientist, Ibn al-Haytham, or al-Hazan as he's called in the West, he realizes that the eye is a very complex structure. And he doesn't have a focusing lens, he has a round crystalline humor. But here it's like a camera obscura, the rays go in, they cross. This reinverts the rays and they're then received at the back of the optic nerve. He explains that rays from different angles all crowd in, and it's the most direct one which shows you the edge best. But you never have an absolutely precise edge. You get edges which are pretty good when they're that range, they're no good at that range, further away they go. And he writes at one point, the eye does not know the edge of any body. That's to say, we never absolutely certify an edge, and that's the consequence of the optical system he adopts. And if you look at Mona Lisa, there's no lines. There are no fixed edges at all. There are areas of shadow, there are areas of light, and we tend to read edges into it. Looking at it under enormous magnification, there are no edges. This is what's been called Leonardo's fumato, smoked effect, though it's not a term he uses himself. Anyway, that's about the act of seeing, which obviously in terms of reflections, rebounds, the optical phenomena and the blurring of edges is all very relevant to the Mona Lisa. Water for Leonardo is of enormous interest. It's very mobile and it's relatively visible compared with air, compared with fire, and it's much more interesting than earth in that it moves around a lot. So he spent a lot of time looking at motion in water as exemplary of dynamics in a more general sense. Here, sorry, I keep pressing the slide advance when I'm wanting the pointer. This is an amazing kind of synthetic demonstration of vortices in water with great exploding rosettes of air. He's putting together a series of observations. It's not a miraculous photograph. And working on the Codex Leicester, with Domenico Lorenzo and myself, we noticed these two little drawings here. And he says in one of the notes, get a ceramicist to make this with glass sides. So in his studio, he's making experimental apparatus. It's the first time I know of any physical phenomena, somebody doing a laboratory experiment to say, does this work? Can I model this? And what he's got here is a tank. He can blow wind or water, or push water through here, through a bocca, through another mouth. And he's doing wind here, and he calls it a sperientia, i.e. an experiment or an experience. And I think this is the bocca, isn't it? This is a fruit of his, it's not an observation in nature as generally taken, but it's a piece of experimental physics before its time. And being Leonardo, he always sees one phenomenon in the light of something else. He can't look at, say, the movement of water without thinking about the curling of hair. He thinks about spiraling draperies, and you can see how this sort of echoes across water and the movements, the dynamic movements of a universal phenomenon. This is a head of Leda for the great lost painting of Leda and the Swan, and it's a wig, very tightly bound wig, which uses elaborations upon the natural movement of water. And then at the fringes, this is a little spout with water coming out, as it were, or hair coming out, and there are trickles of hair from the edge of the wig. It's a wonderful symphony between artificial vortices and natural vortices. In this note, he says, note how the movement of hair resembles that of water, and he goes on to explain why that is. Here, little cascades of Mona Lisa's hair, little rivulets of drapery. This is a very fine muslin silk, and her husband was a silk merchant, gathered over a stiffer undergarment. And the semi-translucent shawl here, which is not contemporary Florentine fashion, but added by Leonardo, does the same kind of thing. So you can get a sense of this lateral visual thinking he's always doing. He was a superb observer. It's rare that we can look over his shoulder, as it were. You can see these drawings and you think that looks terrifically realistic. But in one case, we can actually identify where he was, and the structures to some extent survive. This is a tiny drawing. It's about 3 inches wide. Miraculous, tiny, insistent description of what's going on. It's got a chain ferry here with a man and some oxes. He seems to be beating one of the oxes, which is not a very good idea. This is a very turbulent bit of river, and there's a little side channel with a 3-arched bridge in that position. And you go to Adda. This is on the river Adda, not far from Milan. It's where one of Leonardo's aristocratic pupils, the family had their villa at Vaprio d'Adda. Anyway, if you go there, you can find exactly this location. The river has changed a good deal, but here in an 18th century map, you can see quite clearly the little channel and the chain ferry going across there. It's now replaced with a remarkably hideous road bridge. This is focusing on a detail, and there's the little 3-arch bridge, and there's the little 3-arch bridge. This is my own photograph. The people were wondering why I was so keen on photographing them. But it's the bridge I was interested in, not the sunbathers. But that's wonderful, isn't it? No, that's incredible detail to get that. So he's somebody who looks at nature in a very intense and demanding way. And he was employed as a water engineer. In 1503, Florence was at war with Pisa. They were trying to regain Pisa, as Florence has no access to the sea, so they need a port, basically. Anyway, Machiavelli and Leonardo, between them, Machiavelli, the great writer of The Prince, come up with an idea to bypass the river and make it not go through Pisa, which would put Pisa into a deal of trouble. And the map here in the Madrid codices, it crosses 2 pages, and at this point he's working out how you can divert the Arno. This is Pisa, that's the sea. Florence is in that direction, and here you can see it says rotura d'Arno, break the Arno here, and the idea was to take it down into this lake. It was a fiasco. Water doesn't much like doing what it doesn't want to do. It's a very obstinate medium, and that was a bit of a fiasco. But there are other projects which Leonardo were working on, which were ambitious but were basically sound. He worked on a project for a huge arching canal from Florence down to the navigable bit of the Arno, east of Pisa, west of Pisa. So this is not diverting it around Pisa, and it's actually a measured map, believe it or not. You've got a scale running along the bottom here, and it's pricked through onto another sheet. I've called this the Jackson Pollock of the mapmaker's art. But he could never draw inert maps. He could never do an RAC or an AA map. He would have found that totally inexpressive and inappropriate. So you get this. You think, what's he doing here? This is Florence. There's Prato and Pistoia and this great arch and all this mess in between. This is the route of the present A11 Autostrada Undici, and this is the levels. This is how you build it. There's too much mountainous, there's too much unfavourable terrain in between. So here you have Florence, you have Prato, Pistoia. This is another of his maps, Prato and Pistoia, and it goes up there. He would take it down to rejoin the Arno. This goes across to the motorway at Pisa Nord, where the airport is. But you can see what he's doing. And he does work out how many labourers you would need, what the cost of labourers was, and so on. He hoped the Wool Guild would take it on as an economic project, finance it. They didn't, but it's a feasible project, but it shows how perceptive is Leonardo about geology, as we would now call it. And during the course of, and he also did more minor engineering jobs for Florence. This is a weir which is obviously giving trouble. The weir is actually on that map. This is the Arno and Mugnone, and there are 2 weirs here which have ruptured in the middle, and it's excavating the bank here. It goes off and excavates even more here, and he notes in left to right handwriting, somebody else is meant to read it, the damage that was being caused. We don't have the solution, but he acted as a kind of consultant in these hydraulic engineering enterprises. But looking at the Arno, looking hard at the river, at the mountains, the cuttings and so on, he decides the earth must be incredibly ancient. which is a heretical view. The Earth had a finite time, and basically the Earth in the Renaissance and the Middle Ages was believed to be much like it is now. Local differences, but not big differences. What Leonardo decided, looking at what we would now call strata of fossils, he called them niki, he called them shells, was that there must have been multiple inundations of the Arno Valley. Not just one inundation like the Bible says, but multiple inundations. He looks at these strata of shells, he can see evidence the animals were living there. They were flourishing in these strata. So he decides that there must be a vast history of the body of the Earth that there must have been lakes, and gradually they're drained by rivers, and the rivers cut through the mountains, revealing these ancient strata. And he writes, the Arno composed two large lakes, the first of which is where now the city of Florence is down here, flourishing together with Prato and Pistoia. So all that area of the canal was once a great lake or a sea, really. A second lake was generated and emptied its waters into the above-mentioned lake, enclosed about where we now see Gironi, and occupied all the mentioned upper valley for a space of 40 miles in length. And this is Arezzo, which is upper Arno territory. So all this would have been flooded, and indeed the sea would have come quite a long way in. It's an amazing vision. We now accept that this is the sort of thing that the body of the Earth did, but in Leonardo's time it's a very, very novel idea. And he's insistent that the biblical deluge couldn't do this. This is a little drawing, one of his rare drawings of what we would now call fossils. And he says, the foolishness and simple-mindedness of those who require these animals should be carried by the deluge to these places far from the sea. How another sect of ignoramuses assert that nature or the heavens created them in these places through celestial influences. Leonardo could get very angry with false opinions, and there's an enormous amount of argument in the Codex Leicester about the history of the body of the Earth. And if we look at Mona Lisa and then look back on that quote, in ancient times there were two large lakes. You can see that is basically the situation here, and indeed there's a lower water course here. This is an old one which is going to become full of water again at some point. This upper lake is going to break through. Some of the mountains are unstable. So it's a dynamic landscape. It's a landscape of change, of flux. It's a living body of the Earth. He does call the body of the Earth exactly that, il corpo della terra. So it's a very animate view of the Earth, not just as a static thing which is out there as it stands. And then the theoretical framework behind this is an ancient one. It's the old idea of a microcosm and macrocosm. The microcosm is our body, and we are a lesser world, and everything in the outer world is reflected in our body and vice versa. There's a unity of cause and effect, so that the macrocosm, the more cosmic and the larger scale structures are essentially mirrored in our body. We might say that the earth has a vegetative soul, and that its flesh is the soil, its bones are the arrangements of the connections of the rock, of which the mountains are composed. Its cartilage is the tufa, its blood is the veins of waters. The lake of the blood, which is throughout the heart, is the oceanic sea. Its decrease of the blood through the pulses in the earth is thus, it is the flow and ebb of the sea. It's a much longer quotation, that's just an excerpt. But you can get a sense of how Mona Lisa is about that, isn't it? That idea of the body of the woman being a living thing, the body of the earth being a living thing is very much underpinning this, and this is getting towards what I'm calling a universal picture, a kind of philosophical picture. And if we look at some of the drawings in the Codex Leicester, and I won't go through this text, but you can see here an imaginary cross-section of the earth with what he calls venae d'aqua, veins of water or vessels of water. And here he's looking at this is very diagrammatic. He's not saying this is what it really looks like. Bits fall off the outer crust of the earth into this inner void, and all the centres of gravity of the Earth and the sphere of water all change, and they're mighty upheavals of the Earth and sinkings of the Earth and flooding and so on. It's an extraordinarily violent and view of it. At the bottom here, in a very unusual diagram, he does this. Sorry, I must stop doing that. He does it geometrically. This is that bit of the Earth has fallen down from here and would cause enormous disruption. So the centre of gravity of the Earth and the centre of waters has changed. He says at one point he thinks the Mediterranean will become a river. Once the Straits of Gibraltar had become, probably not true, but it's a fantastic thought, amazingly innovatory thought. And if we look at some of his drawings, just put them beside each other, you'll get a sense of the microcosm of the body of the Earth and the body of the person. Here, this again is here again is the one of the studies of the Arno, which you can see is spectacularly not navigable at this period. And here is a demonstration, obviously, of superficial vessels, blood vessels of the human body. And this comes out of a dissection in 1507, 1508 in the winter of an old man who claimed to be 100 years old. And Leonardo said, I made an anatomy to see the cause of so sweet a death. And he looks at the vascular system, and he decides that the old man's vascular system ceased to function very well. It was the young person, it's labelled up here, young, has this very straight, coursing blood supply. Older people have very tortuous blood supplies, and he knew as a river engineer that this led to silting up. So he said the old man died basically because the vessel around the heart had become silted up, which is very smart. But it's because of his vision of the commonality of water in the body of the Earth and blood in the body of the person that he can make these kind of leaps of imagination. He thinks at one point of doing an isolated system of the blood vessels and the main organs of the body, something Jonathan Miller did in The Body in Question. And he does that, and he just sketches it and says this is what it will look like. But this up here he calls the albero delle vene, the tree of the vessels. So he thinks of this very deliberately as a tree. And coming out of the centenarian dissection, the dissection of the 100-years-old man, he makes this enormous anatomy, in this case of a woman, the irrigation of a woman's body. This is all the channels which transmit things, the urinogenital, the respiratory system, the vascular system. He must have done one of the man as well, which we don't have. The drawing breaks down. It's simply too ambitious. Even Leonardo's graphic skills can't carry all this through, but it's a totally heroic vision of the irrigation systems of the body of the Earth. And being Leonardo, he has to get mathematics out of it. The ultimate proof for Leonardo is if you can do a mathematical analysis. And he looks here at the bronchi and the lungs, which bifurcate absolutely regularly. That's to say, that cross-sectional area there, that is half at that point, so they add up and so on. It goes down 2, 4, 8, and so on. It's a system of bifurcation, so your area for the tube has to diminish in a precisely mathematical manner. And he then looks at trees and says, trees do the same thing. If you're going to operate with a branching system, although trees are full of what he calls accidenti, of contingencies and irregularities and things which are not precisely geometrical, but the basic law in trees is that the cross-sectional area at each point will be equal. If you did cuts at that point and measured them, broadly speaking, it would be equal. So he's getting a mathematical system for water flow, for the flow of non-compressible fluids, which Bernoulli does the next century. But again, this is a very, very remarkable piece of thinking. And in the case of the heart, he's able to do a miraculous little bit of geometrical modelling, which is just sensational. This, as my colleague Francis Wells, who's a surgeon, has pointed out, is an ox heart, which is perfectly good for examining how a heart works. And this valve here, which is an aortic valve, is a three-cusp valve, a tricuspid valve, which Leonardo shows here in various ways, underneath from isolation, in isolation, and open, and so on. So he shows, I've inset that into the page to show this, this three-cusp valve. And in order to say, how does this valve work? And it's a passive valve. He could see there's nothing pulling it. There's no musculature. There are no little lines of things pulling it to make it work. So he knows it's a passive valve. So he begins to look at the vortices inside the neck of the aorta. He's working out here what happens. The blood goes through and it goes into this constricted sort of flask-like end of the aorta. Here he shows it more diagrammatically with the vortices pouring back and revolving in the valve. What happens is the blood is pumped through, it hits this constrained area, the vortices spin in the valves and they close the valve. So you get poof, the blood goes through, it stops, and then the next beat it goes through. That's basically how it works. My mother had one of these heart valves inserted, and it wasn't much different from Leonardo's one. And Francis Wells has reformed his mitral valve operation in the light of Leonardo's drawings. But at the top here, we've got, Leonardo says, build it in glass. Again, a very remarkable thing of doing. Build it in glass to see if it works, and you can stain the water with millet seed or panic grass seed in order to see the vortices at work. And when I was in America, Maury Garib, who was a professor of aeronautical and biological engineering at Caltech, wrote to me and he said, I'm intending to build Leonardo's heart valve. Do you want to come? I was on a plane rather quickly. And he was building this model which you see here. This is before the membranes were put in, before the valves were put in. He's picking up on the model, obviously, and this is the model of the neck of the aorta, and this is modern imaging techniques. Leonardo used grass seed to try and see what was happening, but very astonishing. I'm interested in a way if Leonardo got things right, but I'm fascinated by this transfer of knowledge, that he's going from turbulence in his experimental demonstrations, turbulence in water, in canals and rivers, into the heart. And he's seeing things he's got no right to see. So he really couldn't see what was happening inside the valve. It's a wonderful example of arguing by analogy, which if there are any scientists in the audience, you don't necessarily publish the analogy in the papers, but it's an amazing way of thinking about new phenomenon which you have to explain. Right, what we have, and we have a little animation that we did for the exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum. The heart works like wringing out a towel. It doesn't work just by pushing. It gets this enormous power from the twisting of the motion. These are by Steve Maher, who's a genius of these. We're going to do some more animated work. Yeah, they're the vortices. Keep your eye on these little fellows. That drawing you may recognise, it's the one of the weirs on the Arno near Florence. I love that because you could write enormously long exhibition labels explaining this and be very tedious and people wouldn't read them and so on. But I love that effect, what I call the aha effect, where you watch it and go, I can see what's happening there. I'm talking about doing some computer-generated imagery with Leonardo and building machines in computer-generated imagery, and also his reconstruction of And Leonardo's 500th anniversary of his death is in 1519, so is in 2019. So if anybody's got finance, we'll be glad to hear from you. Anyway, that's the Mona Lisa and the body of the earth. And I hope you've got some sense of how all this knowledge of Leonardo is inherent in the picture. It's not put in a preparatory way, but his understanding of the totality of how the body of the earth and the body of the woman works is embedded in this in a way. And he needs to know all this in order to make a picture which really tells. Mona Lisa never left his hands. He kept it with him till the end of his life. He knew it was special. And when the Cardinal of Aragon's visiting party visited Leonardo when he was in France in 1517, they went down the hill from the royal castle to his manor house. He was big salary and put up very well. And one of the things that Leonardo showed them, as well as the visiting party, as well as the anatomical and mechanical ones, he showed them the Mona Lisa. Anyway, it's just to give you some idea of it is a remarkable painting, and so much went into it, and he in a sense invites you to get out of it what he put in and what else you might like to get out of it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
After that, are there any questions? Shall I?
Okay, the Mona Lisa is the combination of Leonardo's life thought processes. Is it true to say that these were present in his other works? I mean, he didn't paint that many paintings,
Yeah.
but can you say that other works did show this as well? Or?
In general terms, yes. I mean, what he regarded as representing nature was not taking a photograph, as it were, to use an anachronistic idea, i.e. imitating nature superficially. He said, I need to understand how nature works, and I remake it. So the portrait is a remade Mona Lisa Gherardini, but remade in Leonardo's terms. Yes, this is probably the peak picture for that, but it's there in the Virgin Child and St. Anne background and so on. This, other than the fact this doesn't have dynamic movement of the body in it, this does almost everything Leonardo wanted. The Last Supper, for instance, he's interested in how the disciples react. Christ says, one of you will betray me. And there's also reference to the Eucharist, both momentous. And the disciples leap up and they go like that, they go like that. And artists could use gesture, but he says, why do we gesture like that? So he looks at the nervous system and he looks at how voluntary motion is transmitted down the brachial plexus into the arms and so on. So there's a whole, the Last Supper, when you look at, there's anatomical machinery going on there and psychological machinery, this kind of system of nervous plumbing which he uses. So in every picture and in the Last Supper, of course, there is perspectival optics, i.e. there's which is a much more dogmatic optics than in the Mona Lisa. By the time Mona Lisa, he's rather lost faith in linear perspective. And he's doing it by depth of field, as we would now call it. He's doing it by atmosphere and a whole series of other clues which make the background recede, including coloristic. He's pitched the colours so that some recede and some advance. Yeah, it's there in all of them, but Mona Lisa, it's there to an absolutely fundamental degree and to an even greater extent than in other pictures. Yeah.
Could you say why has the painting become so universally known, acknowledged, loved, whatever?
Yeah, I wrote a book years ago, not too long ago, anyway, some years ago, called Christ to Coke, How Image Becomes Icon. And I looked at various images which have become iconic, ranging from the face of Christ and to the Coke bottle. And if I knew the formula, then I would be the world's greatest marketing man. But you can get a sense that they're incredibly good images. They remain robust even when they're very degenerated. You know, Mona Lisa, or even Warhol, when he makes these Mona Lisas which are just blots of dark and shade, you still think Mona Lisa. So they're very robust, but they also do something that they play on your imagination, your experience, and the great artists invite you in. Ones like Rembrandt, Velázquez, some lesser artists tell you what to see. What Leonardo does is he's put all this into the picture and then he invites you to come in, but it's a generous invitation. You can get so much out of it. And it was famous early on. It was copied a lot early on, and that is odd because it's a portrait, as I say, of a bourgeois Florentine woman. If it was a portrait of a pope or a king then, or queen, you would probably have multiple versions produced for sending out to the provinces or whatever. So it became recognized as an important picture early on, and it's called La Gioconda early on, the wife of Francesco del Giocondo. And in some inventories, the Duke of Buckingham tried to buy it when he was in Paris, and the king's courtiers said, "No, it's our best picture, keep hold of it." So he had a copy made, and in the inventory, all the artists' names are listed until you come to the Mona Lisa copy. He had it just called La Gioconda. That's all you need. So it is astonishing. In a way, it's a very slippery answer, because I don't think it's susceptible to a kind of step-by-step logical answer. But great pictures, if I make the generalization, great art is essentially a generous act on behalf of the artist, and less great art tends to be rather more pernickety in what they're choosing you to look at. Yeah.
Do we have any idea how long it took to paint it? How many hours, how many days?
Yeah, we do have, well, there's two or three ways of getting at that. Vasari, the biographer of the artist, said he worked on it for 4 or 5 years and it was still unfinished. Now that is quite cute, because Leonardo began it in 1503 or maybe 1502, and he left Florence in 1507, 1508. Vasari knew Leonardo's father's son, one of his other sons. He knew Francesco del Giocondo's son, so he was pretty well informed about it. So he knew that when it left Florence, it was unfinished. And if you look at the technique of the picture, the head is painted terrifically thickly. A lot of paint, it's very heavily worked. The hands are quite thinly painted, which is much more like the Virgin Child and St. Anne, which is a late picture. And Pascal Cott's done technical analysis, as have the Louvre, and they show lots of changes of mind. And I think he was probably working on it all the way through. And yeah, he's a slow painter. But if you've got to do all this knowledge, all this acquisition of knowledge, all this lateral thinking, the Leder's wig, for instance, he designed the back of it. Raphael wouldn't have done that. You know, you're not going to show the back of the wig, but it's kind of crazy in a way. But it's a wonderful craziness. Yeah.
Well, Martin, thank you very much indeed. Lots of food for thought. Please come over and buy the book.